Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio, iTunes, and others. My guest for this show is Maxim Pozdorovkin. He's directed multiple documentaries, including Capital, Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer, the Notorious Mr. Bout, Our New President, and his most recent, now available right now on HBO, The Truth About Killer Robots. So welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to talk to you is because you say that robots are not only taking away our jobs, but they're affecting our humanity. You say in the show on HBO now, The Truth About Killer Robots, that, and through the voice of a robot you have speaking on the show, that human capacities began to deteriorate, special capacities and memory were affected first, physical and digital world became one, and you were alone with your desires. And the Guardian quotes you as saying, if you look at the effects of automation broadly, globally right now, it's much more pervasive. The things happening, de-skilling, the loss of human dignity associated with traditional labor, they will have a devastating effect much sooner than that long-distance threat of unchecked AI. And this is really interesting to me. What you're saying is everything that's happening already is affecting humanity in a bad way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not that everything is affecting humanity in a bad way, but when I was trying to make the film, I was trying to correct certain blind spots that existed in our thinking about automation. Like for a long time, I wanted to make a film about automation. I didn't know how to do it, how you could make something cinematic that wasn't just kind of explaining statistics to you of what's happening. And in the years that I've been making this film, I watched, all the news reports on the subject. I read a bunch of books about AI and automation, and almost all of them had the same kind of blind spots. And the main one was that almost all of them kind of moved from this slightly marketing premise of what robots can do for you. And consequently, almost all the voices in those pieces and in the books and in the kind of like little video pieces that were made about the subject, almost all the voices were exclusively the voices of CEOs, technology owners, engineers, programmers, so a number of people who are directly benefiting from the technology. And so I thought, and it's natural that when potential dangers of a technology were talked about in this context with these blind spots, with this kind of marketing premise of what robots can do for you, naturally the only kind of adverse effects that is of concern to people like Elon Musk or to are these long-term advanced consequences of general intelligence or of unchecked AI, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not dismissing that those things could and probably will have some kind of adverse effects in the future. I'm just trying to push back against, trying to uncover this kind of myopia that exists as a result of this kind of marketing and techno-optimistic coverage of the issue. And I'm trying to see AI not as something that's in the distant future, but something that's a continuation of the automation process that started with, automating manufacturing in the 70s, or even you can trace it back to Ford and Taylor, et cetera, and the assembly line work. But the idea is just to see this continuity, so you're not always just looking into the future and thinking about how it's going to affect. So we can kind of reorient ourselves and also think about how our present day encounters with algorithms and with automation all across in the service sector everywhere are also part of this process that is worth thinking about. And that's the thing that I always thought was lost in almost all the coverage of it.
Okay, so you corrected me and when I said it's all of the stuff, but in a sense, really it is all the technology, it's all the automation, it's all the AI, all of those combined are in their separate ways having an effect on what it is to be human.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what I wanted to get from you, and what I really like about your documentary that's on HBO, is that you talk to the people like you meant that are not usually exposed and who really don't get a chance to have a voice in how automation is affecting them. You talk to the workers and what have you. So
to me, it was like almost like a sci-fi true crime Trojan horse, and inside of it is like a Studs Terkel now, book. And the idea was to the film is filmed in the 4 largest economies in the world, and the idea was to look at the way that automation is happening, and the reason that you need the voices of the workers, not just because they should be represented, but also a lot of these, for example, people will read an article about automation of trucking, right? And the article will say that by this year, this many trucking jobs may be lost. But that really doesn't tell you very much about the process by which that happens. And when you go, so we went to a lot of truck stops and filmed with truck drivers, and what they will tell you is that their job has been stripped of the kind of skills that they took pride in. So if you're a truck driver for 30 years, or even if you're just how to drive a car, you feel yourself having gotten better at this job that you've been doing. Now truck drivers are basically babysitting the computer and are there sort of to take the fall for any kind of accidents. They don't decide where they stop. They don't decide where they fuel. They can't decide, they can't take their journey and break it up according to their own desires. So that's used to put downward pressure on wages. So the fact that they're doing very little it's a qualitative transformation of that job. And when we hear about all these things like, for example, suicide rates going up amongst older white men in America, there's lots of factors that are contributing to this, opioid addiction, et cetera. But one of them, and one that's really slippery and hard to get around, is the fact that so many of these manufacturing jobs that had this skill component to it, that skill has been sucked out of it. The jobs have been de-skilled, and a lot of the feelings of dignity that came with doing that job have also disappeared. Now,
when I read that and saw that part, it made me think that the other thing that's happening with these white men who have an increased suicide rate now is they're angry, and that anger has been attributed to the reason that they voted for Donald Trump.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm going to make
a section in the film, but I just won't take it out because there's just too much Trump. But yeah, and ultimately, as automation is this large, abstract, broad idea that appears in all sorts of different ways. It's in your phone, it's in your factory, everywhere. And for a lot of people, it's hard. It's a hard thing to grapple with. It's a hard thing to understand. It's a hard thing to perceive. Whereas the presence of immigrants is something that's very easy to perceive. And so a lot of I think that like the nativist and nationalist and anti-immigrant sentiments of the Trump era, but in general all across the world, really have to do with the fact that so much of labor, is under threat. And it's under threat both in sort of in a kind of numerical, quantitative way, but also qualitatively. And that creates anxiety. Like when what you're doing isn't providing you with a certain kind of satisfaction, that also, cultivates or translates into a certain kind of political rage that people talk about when they talk about Trump. And
so just to really spell it out, automation leads to anger and frustration, which has led perhaps to electing Trump, and the this massive anger that exists, and maybe even the rise of some of the hate that we're seeing.
I think that yes, I think that's right. I think that automation also destabilizes the economy in ways that we tend to euphemistically cover up with terms like disruption. And, I had this really incredible telling moment when this film premiered at the Toronto Film Festival. And the Toronto Film Festival is a big deal. And when I took a cab just around the festival, and the driver, he was this Ethiopian guy. He didn't know what my movie was, didn't know his subject. He just asked me, "Are you here for TIFF?" And I say, "Yes." And he goes, without me prompting it at all, he goes, "TIFF used to be so wonderful for us because it was like Christmas. There would be so much activity, that it was guaranteed that during these 2 weeks, we would have this massive spike in our income. Now, what happens with Uber and Lyft is that the people that sort of drive occasionally, the freelancers, when there's an increased demand and there's extra work, they'll start driving for those few days and suck out all that extra income. The people who do that job regularly or year round, therefore don't get that. So they're punished for that. And ultimately the only real winners of that are the companies in California.
Interesting. Because, I interviewed Tim O'Reilly last year, and he wrote a book, WTF, in which he talks about Uber, and he talks about how the new software enables companies to, instead of having full-time workers, to have part-time workers, and they just have a program that lets them have 200 part-time workers they don't have to give benefits to, instead of 100 full-time workers. And in a sense, it's this programming capacity to pull up and engage part-time workers as needed. It's the same thing that you just described, really.
Yep.
It's affecting tens of millions of workers.
And also, it's also blinding us to, it's creating sort of unreliable, I think, unemployment statistics, because one of the other things that happens is that as jobs are de-skilled, for a long time, you just have these kinds of jobs. So if you take it as an example, if you go to Best Buy, right? Best Buy is full of employees, and none of them know a damn thing, right? So it's the lowest kind of, so there's no expertise whatsoever. And if you compare that to sort of old, electronic shops or old whatever, record shops or something like that, there's a certain kind of expertise behind the people that run the business. Now, in chain stores, that's almost completely gone. The employees are still there. They're still, because they have no expertise there, can be paid whatever the bare minimum that they get paid. And that will, while they're there, we're adapting to using iPads to check out, to do all those kinds of things. So in other words, that aspect of what is happening to the experience, what are people learning in these jobs, what's happening to that experience of labor, that's what we wanted to focus on. Because that always gets lost, and ultimately a lot of times people will see, okay, jobs are going to disappear, and then they see that unemployment isn't that high, and they feel like that the prediction is wrong, and the economy is way too resilient in all sorts of ways, and there's all these euphemisms like entrepreneur and disruption that are constantly carted out to distract us from what's actually happening at the structural level in the economy. And for us actually, you brought this up earlier, but using the automated narrator, using the robot narrator in the film was an attempt to avoid a certain kind of thing that I see artists doing, which is suggesting that creative tasks and creative careers are somehow immune from automation. So there are all these movies done around the question of, can a robot be a DP, or can a robot direct a movie? Can an AI edit a movie? And of course, the computer fails in all these movies, and we have this artificial sense of optimism, as if aren't we lovely and unique, that we can't be replaced. And it felt like that the worst thing that we could do in our movie would be to hire James Earl Jones sound-alike to add human gravitas to it. Because if you look at the economic data, the creative sort of industries, so photography, film, music, all what's happening structurally in the economy is exactly the same as in all these other industries. In other words, you go from a healthy bell-shaped curve distribution of income to a star system. So that curve is hollowed out, and then basically no one makes any money except the platform owners and then a few sort of extremely successful superstars in that field. And so for us, I really wanted to grapple with the fact that this technology is also invading film production. And so even the way that we use this Android narrator, which was cheaper, and we could tweak the script all the way to the very end, and we didn't have to use a studio. We use drones indoors in ways that people traditionally use steady cams, because I feel like it's not about being a Luddite and holding on to the past. It's about actually actively engaging and grappling with what the technology is doing to you and how it's transforming your life. Like holding out in some way feels, foolish and false.
So a couple things. One, our conversation about scheduling workers makes me realize that Job scheduling itself has been automated.
Well, I mean, well, virtually everything has been, I mean, everything that's digitized and transformed and regulated by some kinds of algorithmic activity is automated. You know, that's automation.
And algorithmic activity is almost everywhere you go.
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it is I've heard some people refer to it as mechanization, if you want to think it broadly. The idea of just subsuming human life to mechanical rhythms. And those mechanical rhythms could be a metronome, or it could be an alert on your phone or a notification. I mean, those are very different things, but I'm trying to get people to think of them as a kind of as a continuation of a similar process. And that way you can see our excessive dependency on our phones for memory for all these things. That's a certain kind of mechanization where to retrieve it, you're adding an extra step where a person would do this rather than kind of having this be done internally with your brain.
I went to a conference maybe 2-3 years ago about immortality. A Russian .com millionaire had put it together, and he wanted. I
heard about that conference.
Yeah, I was there, and he basically saying by the mid 2040s it'll be doable by porting our minds into hardware so that everything's replaceable. There's no parts that can't be replaced. And one of the presenters was working on an electronic part of the brain that handles memory. And in a sense, what you just said, we're doing it with our cell phones. I mean, I don't remember phone numbers of people anymore that I would have always remembered because I don't need to. So our memory.
Yeah, and here's the point. My suggestion isn't that we should memorize our phone numbers, even though it's not probably a terrible thing to do. The thing is that what we should recognize is that these abilities, the capacity to remember data, the capacity to orient yourself in like new geographical surroundings. These are kinds of things that are evolutionary, but we've won evolutionary of it. We've accrued over thousands of years. And I'm just suggesting that people should consider the consequence of disposing with them that quickly, the rate at which we're losing this kind of thing, the rate of, our dependency on the technology.
And I think it's not disposing, really. It's misuse.
Eroding, yeah. Well, I mean, I think our memory, I think that a lot of these things there's documentation that they have been eroding and disappearing.
So it's not that I'm getting older.
Well, those are mutual.
All right, got that out. But yeah, I mean, when I was in my 20s, I could. I took an IQ test and I had to reel back in reverse order 7-digit numbers. I don't know that I could do that anymore. And maybe it's because I'm older, and maybe it's because I smoke too much pot, and maybe it's because I depend so much on the computer and the phone for everything. So who knows? And it's
I'm really wary of actually reading a lot of Jaron Lanier's books and stuff. I became really wary of the way that the techniques of behaviorism are applied to sort of social media activity. And, one of the things while making this film, I really stopped reading off tablets because I wanted, which is mostly I read books, precisely because I just want all the associations that happen to come from internally. And what happens is inevitably when you read anything on a screen, there are hyperlinks, there are suggestions, there are notifications that pull away at your associative reasoning. And somehow for me, and ultimately they pull away from it, not for, or you're triggered with those kinds of prompts, not for any good reasons, but just as a kind of as a way of testing you to see what would in the future generate more engagement. And that feels to me like it's very harmful, and moreover curtails and cuts off this very beneficial process of our associative thinking when we're just reading off a page and thinking.
Yeah, it makes me think I'm pulling a book from my bookshelf. This has a very different sensory feel. This one's from 1879, but it's a hobby of mine, collecting old books, because there is a different feel. There's a smell to it, even.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously like the haptic pleasures and the tactile aspect of it, but I really thinking about a lot of these kind of mechanization and the role that algorithms play in parceling and our attention and in trying to engage us, I just wanted to not separate myself entirely from it, but to try to limit it in some ways.
And one point I think it's coming clear to me is algorithms are a part of automation.
Of course, yeah.
I mean, an algorithm is, I have my own content management system, and I have algorithms for how people get shown information. Mm-hmm. And algorithms are something that we encounter every day throughout the day. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about automation, it's not necessarily an arm that moves and does something. It can be a couple lines of code.
Right. I think and I think that's right. And one of the funny things about the history of the word robot is that whenever something comes out and it's something that's new and can do some kind of human, a task with human-like skill, whenever that happens, that thing is called a robot. Now, when that becomes ubiquitous, when that just becomes of everyday life, it starts being called a machine. And the next new thing starts to be called a robot. So the word is kind of applied in there's a kind of these shifting sands where the word is always applied later and later. And a similar kind of myopia exists with our thinking about AI. And the idea is we still have, just like when we see about an industrial accident where a robot kills a man, we just go to the trope of the Terminator. With AI, we also have this idea of a controlling central force as that's what we're heading to, that would be a threat. And in reality, artificial intelligence, as we say in the movie, artificial intelligence arrived in small steps. So all the data management that we all create online, the management of that data and the usage of that data to regulate your and other people's activity on the internet or engagement with certain platforms, all of that is automation. That's AI. That's artificial intelligence. All that's doing is it's building models and making predictions based on those models, user models. And so, so that's what we wanted to also kind of get into in the film, is that to get people away from just thinking about this long distant threat, because that really helps a lot of the people who don't want you to think about the present day threat.
And in your documentary, you give 3 examples of how people were killed by robots. And we're going to just need to do a brief show ID, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that, okay? Mm-hmm. And for the radio show, I just pause for a couple seconds so I can find it on the editing. And my guest for this show is Maxim Pozdorovkin. He's directed multiple documentaries, including Capital, Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer, The Notorious Mr. Bout, Our New President, and his new one, which is on HBO now, The Truth About Killer Robots. So your documentary gives 3 examples of robots that actually killed people. Right. And that's a total violation of Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics.
That's right.
So, that idea that science fiction promised us, robots will be safe, forget about it.
That's right. And, for me, this film, like I mentioned before, I wanted to do something about automation for a long time. And there was this accident at the Volkswagen factory in Bout where a manipulator arm crushed a worker's chest. And I went there, and it was sort of fascinating because the case still remains open to this day. And the workers were all told that they were not allowed to speak about the case at all. But all of them were very happy to talk about the way that automation has impacted and changed their lives and their work environment. And so I thought, okay, I wanted to try to make a film which would basically look at cases of literal death as a result of automation as a window onto considering the kind of sort of metaphorical death of automation, this kind of this dehumanization process that we've been talking about. So that was the first case, and each case maps onto a sector of the economy. So the first case we look at, first act takes place in Germany and China, and we look at manufacturing and the way that kind of traditional automation of manufacturing, which is things like car manufacturing, has changed, and advances in precision and kind of a last holdout for humans was finger precision. So in making very small things like cell phones, the dexterity that humans had was a certain kind of last advantage. Recent advances in precision make it that a lot of even that work, which has been the majority of human-done manufacturing work that remains, is being replaced very quickly. The second act deals with a guy who had a guy named Joshua Brown who had an autonomous Tesla, and he was really into testing it and doing all these things about it. And then eventually, 2 weeks before he died, he saw that his Tesla helped him as a utility truck swerved into his lane. And he posted this video, and it became quite famous, and even Elon Musk himself retweeted it. And then 2 weeks later, he was watching or listening to a movie and not paying attention, and the Tesla didn't register, but there was a semi-truck crossing across the highway, went under it, the guy gets decapitated, the car goes for nearly a mile, cuts down several trees and electrical poles. It's a really kind of gnarly scene, but that story for us pegs onto the service sector, and the way that the act starts is by us saying, is the narrator says, the automation of the service sector required your trust and cooperation. And so the rest of the sector is the way that we're adapting to this transformation of the service sector. So we look at at autonomous vehicles. We look at kind of the consequences, such as the suicides amongst cab drivers and protests, to the destabilizing effects of Uber. We look at a lot of just integration of robotics into our daily lives away from factories. And I think of this film as kind of a work of science nonfiction. And what I mean by that is that I didn't want to make a movie about science or robotics, like an informational program. So I thought about, what do science fiction writers do when they create? They look at the world around them and they identify certain pieces or certain tendencies that they can recognize will become dominant in the future. And then they take those tendencies and they build a whole world out of that. And so and I tried to do something similar with this film, where I approach is looking for things that are already present in the world that foretell what the future that we're going to be living in. And so that's sort of the second sector. And the third sector of the film, and the third murder, is a case where there was an active shooter at a Black Lives Matter protest who killed several cops. And he was holed up in a community college, and they used a bomb disposal robot to just go and blow him up with C4. And that section is really about jobs that we had kind of sentimental ideas about, in the sense that we thought that they could never be replaced. So the section of the film is called Final Displacement. And there, in that case, in the Dallas case, the story is told by the sniper who had to go dig out the guy who they killed out of a rubble, and had the robot not been available, he probably would have been the one who killed the person. And to me, what was sort of troubling and fascinating in that story is that had the outcome been different, had the sniper killed him, there would be nothing kind of remotely interesting about the story. It's not really problematic after the guy, it's tragic, but he already killed a few people. But the fact that they used a robot just feels uncomfortable. It touches on something that's very, very deep inside of us. And even the police chief, when he talks about the incident, he sort of flubs the line. And so the rest of that section, it just deals with all these ways in which aspects of the economy that we thought wouldn't be replaced or couldn't be replaced are being replaced with things like legal work, companionship, etc. So that was that.
I did a little searching on killer robots, and one thing you don't talk about is fully autonomous weapons.
So I was actually about to get to this. Is that and it was on purpose. I used to have a section about drones in the film. And my problem with the way that drones have always been discussed is that almost every single conversation, every single piece that I read about it was kind of went into the weeds about at which point in the control, did the operator back in, in an army base not have control where the optical sensors on the drone become the deciding factor? So it gets into the really like the small technicalities, and as a way of kind of diffusing and scattering culpability. What's fascinating to me about the Dallas case is, again, there's nothing seemingly wrong with it, except it feels wrong. And it gets at this sort of more existential discomfort that the fact is that the machines will be better and better, and the people who are in power will not hesitate to use those machines.
So really what you're talking about is a matter of degree. What you're saying is, if you put a bomb on a drone and then control, not on a drone, on this robot, and it rolls up to this guy who's killing cops, and then you hit a button to blow it up, that's not a lot of autonomous control by the robot. If you have a drone where it is given a target and there's a lock that can be identified with a visual identification, and you hit a button that says fire when this lock is reached, or that this criteria is reached, that's a lot more discretion of the robot. And the ultimate one would be go out and find bad guys and shoot and kill them if they meet the criteria that we've programmed into you.
Right. But I think that in all those three cases, and we touch on variations in terms of some of the research on it of all those three cases. But to me, what's interesting is that in all those three cases, the concept of culpability, let's say something goes wrong. Let's say the robot kills someone by accident, regardless of how advanced, whether it's a drone or it's a bomb robot.
Or like in the factory.
Yeah, or it's in a factory. The problem is that culpability and our normal concepts of responsibility are completely scattered. And that creates plausible deniability for everyone involved. And the thing is, a professor at Carnegie Mellon says this in the film, is that the rate of technological advance will always outstrip the rate at which laws will change. It takes a really long time to change laws. And the laws as they exist now are really ill-adapted for dealing with these kinds of situations. And as the technology becomes more ubiquitous and more present, that's going to be a problem. And so, because what happens is that when a drone kills a wedding party, you don't know who's really responsible. It could be it could be the operator, it could be the company that made the sensor, it could be the operator that made the company that made the drone. There are all these potential parties that are culpable, and that makes it impossible to pin the blame on anyone specific. And that ultimately will be to the advantage of the companies. Likewise, with driverless cars and autonomous cars, Uber and Tesla and all these companies, for as long as they can, they will be trying to do everything they can to identify, to call these things assistants, like co-pilots, all these things that will not make it sound like they're autonomous. But when you look at the way that people interact with them, like Joshua Brown, or you think about the concept the operative concept that we all have in our head when thinking about it, it's the Jetsons. It's a car that kind of takes you from place to place. That's also created by the advertisement, by journalism, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like that these shifting concepts of legal responsibility, of what we even call these things, is going to be this great battle. And coming back to your point about Asimov, people know the Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. You know that a robot should not kill a human, and should never kill a human. But if you actually read the short story collection in Asimov, what he did was he projected that in the future, around 2052, there's going to be a time where there's going to be so many robots that we need some kinds of laws and regulations for them. But what every single story shows is that the messiness of human life, the messiness of like the circumstantial kind of factors of our world together is so complex that all those laws will always fail. So that's the real meaning of Asimov's laws, is that he, from way back then, showed us that this will be a central problem in our time, because kind of even the concept of law is very problematic in relationship to a robot or to a constructed mechanical entity.
And if we look at regulations,
Right.
there's tens of millions of people just in the United States who support people who try to get rid of every regulation they can.
Right.
So they would probably do that with robots and AI too.
Well, I think the institution of government is so the impression of it is so eroded in the public kind of imagination. The idea that a government can't really do anything, and I think that regulation, the idea of regulation, is really, just like the idea of redistribution, is really tarnished by the anti-government agenda that's been going on since Thatcher or Reagan or what have you.
It's true. So in the movie, you don't just cover killer robots, though. You do a section of it about a guy who developed a robot who he married.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
That was also another one of these blind spots. Initially, we went to this convention in Japan, this called IREX, and there was kind of a lot of attempts to integrate these human-like android women into the service sector. Now, this was a story where, again, I had seen maybe like a dozen news reports about this place. I'd read a whole bunch of articles, and not a single one of the articles or news reports talked to all the real live women who were stewards at the event, whose jobs were clearly threatened by the presence of these freakazoid androids. And so initially I wanted to correct that blind spot. And likewise with sex robots, I had seen hundreds of kind of reports on it, on the potential of sex robots, and almost all of them were centered around the question of whether the sex is any good, as if that's like really the interesting journalistic empathetic question to ask, which it isn't. And for me, the real factor that we will have to grapple with behind sex robots coming into society is demographics. So the population imbalance that's natural, and the fact that certain people are not able to have partners and mates. And that part of the story takes place in China precisely because in China is ahead of the curve on this development because of the one-child policy and how that has left the situation where there's not enough women in the country. So there it's going to be more pronounced, but that's the factor that will be bringing this, to what will make this not just a novelty, but a part of our lives. And to me, it was kind of ridiculous that none of the coverage engaged with this factor, that no one talks about demographics in any reports about sex robots.
Talking about it, I want to hear more. What are your thoughts about how it'll affect demographics and how demographics are affected?
Well, it's that, if there's an imbalance, and as there's always going to be a sector of a population that's not able to find a relationship. And that's when you have a population that's, even in most countries, there's slightly more women than men, but then that tends to balance out with the death rate. But in a lot of places, you're still going to have a section of a population that's unable to find a spouse or a mate. So what do those people do? And for a long time, they couldn't do anything. They had some sort of clubs. But as the possibility of lifelike companions becomes more real, the stigma that we have of it will also fade away, and there will be more people that engage with it. And I think in China, it's going to come sooner because, as Jiajia, the character in our film, says, he's like, I don't know how to talk to women. I don't know how to please them. I'm not a rich elite guy. So it's sad because he sort of resigned himself to the fact that he won't have a relationship. And the imbalance and the lack of women, just numerically in China with respect to men is, that's what will bring this new element of automation and mechanization into society. And so I'm always interested in what are these kinds of causal factors that are bringing this about.
Well, there are other pieces too. I mean, it makes me think, you've got these people on the neurobehavioral continuum with the Asperger's and autism, and they have more trouble connecting with other people as well.
Yeah, and those robots, those SEAL robots, can help them. But I think that there is a broad negative effect that happens as a result of us interacting with technology that fakes human emotions and fakes human cues.
Oh, what I was going to say was those people who already have problems, if they have a robot to take care of them and they don't have to actually work extra hard or more to develop relationships, then those skills are going to atrophy. Years ago, I did a lot of work looking at smiling. I did muscle electromyographic measures of smile muscles and things like that. And one of the studies that I found that was really interesting was that in Japan, where there's a lot of masking of facial expression, it's a cultural phenomenon, or at least it was, a percentage of the population of cadavers would be found to have highly atrophied smile muscles.
Wow.
And it to me, what you're talking about here is atrophication of all kinds of neurobiological functions that connect us with other people.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that before there's a philosopher in our film that says this, and I've thought about this a lot, and a lot of people will come up to me after screenings and talk about this one moment. And he says this idea: there are very few things that we have that allows us to understand another human being and to kind of connect with another human being. And so those are things like, we can react to tone, we can read facial expressions, we can see when a person is in pain. And immediately when we see that, we react and we feel some kind of gut reaction, either to help a person but we feel something. Empathy, exactly.
Mirror neurons.
This imaginative understanding, the idea that we can imagine what it's like to be another person, is really all we have to build empathy. What happens is every single time you receive a ghost call and you are, let's say, tricked, and so for a second it's a robot, but it sounds lifelike, and you say, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" in a sort of human way, and then you check yourself and you correct and you realize that it's a robot and you hang up or you do whatever. Every single time that happens, you begin to second guess these very basic fundamental building blocks of connection.
Wow. Yeah, it's true.
And what happens is that's all we have. So as that trust erodes, the possibility of connection will become much harder to come by. And these sort of secondary loops of ill consequences for human society, you can also see with this thought experiment, with driverless cars. So say you're driving on the freeway and you want to switch lanes. You look in your side view mirror, you see a car speeding ahead. You don't cut that person off because because you effectively project fallibility onto them. They may be crazy, they may be having a bad day. You cut them in, cut them off, you have an accident. It's going to delay everyone. So you project this fallibility and you stay in your lane and then you pass after them. Now, when we're driving and there's a lot of entities, self-driving cars that are sort of contractually guaranteed to not run into you. That's what the whole premise is that they will stop no matter what you do. We will drive like the biggest assholes with regards to these vehicles. We will be cutting them off. We will be doing all these terrible things because we have this kind of license to be inconsiderate. Partially because we can't really project fallibility because the marketing is that their machines are virtually infallible, that they could go, this hundreds of millions of miles without incident. Now, inevitably, the way that we will interact with these cars will have a secondary effect on the way that we interact with human drivers as well.
Any human.
Any human. So we will become more inconsiderate with regards to other humans. Likewise with sex dolls, and a lot of philosophers and ethicists will say that the problem isn't really any kind of rights or ethical categories that should be applied to the robot, but it's just inevitable that at the neurological level, if you're interacting with an android that's lifelike, your behavior will have a sort of secondary consequence where some of that behavior will spill over onto the way that you interact with real humans. So seeing people as just like a means to an end, which is the way that most people, I assume, interact with androids and sex robots, that will also spill over and make kind of connection more difficult. So
Yeah. All
That
right.
was a
So,
long roundabout way, but yeah, this is something that I thought about a lot, and I was glad to get it into the film because it's a very tough thing to explain. I mean, it's a very hard thing to kind of articulate, but
well, I think even just the fact that we do so much of our communication with less than face-to-face, full sensory connection,
absolutely, yeah.
it does it too is in those ways too. It's not just interacting with a robot; it's interacting through technology.
Yeah, I mean, even texting ultimately strips tone, right? And tone is that's a cue, that's an emotional cue that we don't have.
And that's really a generational thing that has become the preference over phone for voice. So I need to just do a brief show ID again. A little pause. My guest for the show is Maxim Pozdorovkin. He's directed multiple documentaries, including Capital, Pussy Riot, A Punk Prayer, The Notorious Mr. Bout, Our New President, and his newest on HBO, The Truth About Killer Robots. Now, I call my show the Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a top-down to a more bottom-up culture. I think bottom up is the way humans were before there was civilization, where they were connected, lived in hunter-gatherer bands, not even tribes. They were interdependent and cooperative. They had lots of empathy and compassion, not only for themselves and for the rest of the people in their band, but also for nature, which they depended upon. You see any angles from your thinking about all this about AI and robots?
I would think that bottom up remains a potential for some kind of activity, but I think that actually structurally, algorithmically, we're moving much more towards a top-down situation, just because of the way that the structure of the internet privileges monopolies. So basically, monopoly formation, and we're sort of now starting to think about it in Europe, things with regards to antitrust regulations, all these things. But the way that these 4 or 5 major monopolies have evolved would make it seem like we're moving towards much more of a kind of top-down, centralized system that has the illusion of being kind of diffuse and not as centralized. And likewise, I think that we see this politically too, and I think that actually we should try. I don't have that many thoughts on it, but I think we should think about the parallels between authoritarianism and the fact that we're living in a time where digital technology has favored monopolies so strongly.
Well, that getting into authoritarianism, when I think of authoritarianism, I think of narcissism and its friends and psychopaths, and I wonder if there's a tie between robots and narcissism.
Well, I mean, I think that there's the biggest tie is that we are all becoming more narcissistic because of a technology, because the technology is always there to serve our interests and our desires and to move us in this way. So I think that more than anything, the technology enhances and heightens narcissism because, so much of it is on just rewarding the self. So much of it is just driven by these kinds of, the internet rewarding you in various ways for doing things. So I think that, yeah.
So do you have any solutions to all these issues?
No, and I think that, one of them...
Not that you have to.
No. The idea of providing a solution was an interesting one in editing this film, where I had a section about universal basic income and or something that's called positive tax credit, which is the idea that everyone gets some sort of set amount once there's not enough work, so $10,000. But I didn't want to include it in the film, or I didn't include it in the film eventually because I feel like that the great tragedy, or like one of the great tragedies, or one of the great delusions of our age right now, is that, and this is a delusion that I think documentary film really kind of helps along, and the delusion of our age is that like you can watch a TED Talk for 10 minutes and learn theoretical physics. But the idea that the push towards optimization is such that when these massive things happen, like automation is this massive transformative force. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just ubiquitous, and it's going to change all these aspects of human society, human interaction, all these things. And it felt like the worst thing to do would be to say, well, obviously there's problems with this, so this is how we solve it. And that kind of teleological thinking of like, that this is the solution. And you know, to me, it feels like we should grapple with what it is, try to understand what it is in all its ways first, before gunning for the solution. And specifically to the question of like universal basic income or positive tax credit, I could see it not really being anything that's a solution at all, and just create, you know, an even larger population of people with, you know, addicted to opioids with Oculus rigs, you know, and, you know, living off TV dinners. So I didn't want to tunnel into that and present that as I didn't want to think about automation as a problem that needs solving. I wanted to think of it as a kind of modern condition that we have to grapple with, think about, et cetera.
That's the first step in science, is to observe something happening. So you mentioned earlier that as things that are originally described as robots become ubiquitous, then they become machines. Yeah. Now, I had an interesting conversation with Fritjof Capra, who wrote a book about systems theory, the systems view of life. And he talked about how we've transitioned from a kind of a machine metaphoric mind state to a more systems chaos theory kind of mind state. And machines give you a certain way of thinking. You count, you take things apart, you control and dominate them, and they give you a collection of metaphoric filters through which you can see the world. Mm-hmm. How about robots and AI and automation? Can you think of different ways that they're changing our metaphoric?
Sure, absolutely. I think that, I mean, the main one is just a consequence of economic. I mean, I think that this is a tendency that we've had for a long time, and the tendency is to basically to take economic metaphors derived from economics. So metaphors around efficiency and return on investment and things like that, and then apply them uniformly to all aspects of life. So basically expand them to an absolute good. And automation is in a way sort of the MacGuffin, or like the robots are a MacGuffin in a sense, because all that it's doing is allowing those concepts to be entrenched as the only way that things can be done, the only way that, let's say, production can be organized in accordance with, you know, efficiency or all these kinds of economic derived metaphors. And again, so I think that I think that that's the thing that comes to mind.
So it solidifies economic metaphors.
Yeah, it basically takes economic metaphors and makes them universal, rather than just something as a way of thinking about the economy. Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to spend the rest of the interview talking about your other documentaries. The one you did before this one was Our New President. Yeah. And do you have like an overview that you see that you're doing with all your documentaries? Is there something you're trying to do, some message or some idea that you're trying to get across?
I mean, I think my main thing is that I tend to make political films, but I always think that film is a really bad medium for saying anything, and it's a really good medium for feeling something. And I feel like if you're making a movie about, let's say, something topical, and if your movie is just like an illustration of a New Yorker article, I just feel like you've wasted my time and you haven't done your job as a filmmaker. So the idea is that I want to try to make things that explore these issues that journalists also write about, but do it in a way that makes people feel something. So Our New President was an attempt to basically to tell the story of Trump's election in his first year in office entirely through Russian propaganda. So it was trying to make a movie which would be essentially made entirely out of news and factual television without a single true statement in it. So it would be like the disinformation distributed by the federal channels in Russia, and then people on YouTube, Russians on YouTube, reinterpreting and regurgitating this information. And their idea was like, how do you make something about Trump and also about what's happening, but that's not earnest, that tries for a different approach in handling. That's not just, I think so many documentaries have this very kind of self-serious and high-minded tone, which is fine for certain things, but it shouldn't be the only thing. So I tend to think of these subjects through genre filters. So like, for example, you know, Truth About Killer Robots is a film about automation and structural economics, but it's in the guise of a science fiction kind of dystopian sci-fi film. Pussy Riot, you know, was a film about, you know, art and politics, but I structured it as a courtroom drama, as a courtroom kind of drama. And Our New President is this sort of found footage. My joke is that it's like a 78-minute lobotomy, but the idea was, you know, how do you make people actually feel that fake news is bad for you, that it's not just, you can explain what fake news is, you can tell people, oh, this isn't what happened, this is what happened, but that doesn't actually get at the way that a lot of our shared knowledge or our ability is eroded. And, you know, one of the things that I realized while working on Our New President is that the function of propaganda has changed. Is that historical propaganda used to be much more about strategic disinformation. And modern propaganda doesn't try to be consistent at all. It's precisely all about just turning the internet or the infosphere into a garbage dump. It's about throwing out as much inconsistent information as possible, so people are just bombarded with it, and at a certain point, they just give up on the epistemological project of trying to figure anything out, and they become kind of the perfect docile political subjects. There's an example of this in Our New President, where one of the news anchors for a Russian channel introduces Trump when he wins as a troubled teenager from Brooklyn. Now, why would you make that mistake? Why, you know, instead of an asshole from Queens or spoiled asshole? And why make that mistake? And it's also, I mean, it's hard to make that mistake, right? I mean, it's not, one way is not more pro-Russian than the other. And it's hard to, you know, I mean, wherever you look, you'll see that he's from Queens. But this gets at this point, is that the inconsistency is the point. Having all sorts of different versions, it doesn't even matter if it's political content, not political content, but different versions of everything makes it that nothing is true and everything is possible. And it's, you know, and that's sort of politicians like Trump and Putin, that's what they're after, because they're always just pivoting, and they're pivoting as a way of moving the narrative forward.
And when you describe the movie as a lobotomy, you're really talking about what the goal of this new model of propaganda, this disruption of any kind of trust in the media, is really a media lobotomy.
Yeah, I mean, in a long about way. Yeah, I mean, I also want, you know, people to feel that it's bad for them, so people tend to feel bad at the end of the movie because they've just had to ingest so much of it in a kind of very distilled way. The film's like a reductio ad absurdum, so it's, you know, wall to wall of propaganda.
And you've got a couple other movies, The Notorious Mr. Bout and Capital. What's the story with them?
Notorious Mr. Bout is the story of Victor Bout, the arms dealer who was sentenced. He was an inspiration for Nicolas Cage's character in Lord of War.
Oh.
He was the guy, he was entrapped in this way by the DEA, and he's currently serving time in a U.S. penitentiary. Really sort of fascinating character. Then Capital is this kind of city symphony film. It was my first film about the building of a new capital city in Astana, in Kazakhstan, called Astana. And then I also have another film called Clínica de Migrantes, which is also on HBO, and that's about, in your hometown, and that's about
Philly.
About a clinic in Philadelphia a medical clinic that treats undocumented immigrants under the radar. And it's a really great place.
Anything you're working on now?
Finishing, doing a series, and also finishing a movie right now called How to Rob Banks for Dummies, about my very first film professor who was a professor at MIT, but he recently robbed several banks with a video camera and a note. But for like 40 years, he would commit anti-institutional crimes and make films about them.
Oh, that sounds great. I hope you'll keep me informed when that happens.
Okay.
All right, so we got to wrap. This has been fascinating. Again, my guest is Maxim Pozdorovkin. He's a director, most recently, of The Truth About Killer Robots. Check it out on HBO. Thanks, Max.
Thank you. Take care.